Hello, me again. Here to go over part two of today's session with a focus on vocabulary. The purpose of this second shorter video is to do an overview of, I guess, the importance of vocabulary instruction and also to offer three different approaches to vocabulary instruction. The reason that we're focusing on vocabulary is because vocabulary is one of the five pillars that was outlined by the National Reading Panel. Again, in secondary curriculum, because it is so content heavy, we tend to focus on comprehension strategies first. But we have evidence from the screeners or the test data that students also need some work with vocabulary. Now, there are some things to, I suppose, be aware of, and some of these numbers you might find surprising. Students need to be exposed to 8,000 to 12,000 words a year to show any kind of improvement. And that obviously will is a lot. And it's not something that can kind of be done if we're working with one word at a time or one word a day. We also know that we have to expose students to a word on an average of 12 times before they know it well enough for it to improve their comprehension. We're not just talking about orthographic mapping where they can recognize the word on sight. We're also talking about the mental process of being able to tie that word to a definition and to recognize it in context and to use it themselves. 12 times is a very high number, and it can't be done by one teacher working on their own. It would take the concerted effort of an entire staff to be able to expose a word to a student 12 times or so. But if a student is in, let's say, 6 or 7 subjects a day, and they hear that word in every single subject, then it'll only take 2 days to get the exposure that they need. There is a shared vocabulary. So if we move away from the tier 3 content specific things to the tier 2 words that really no one teaches because I don't think we're all assuming someone else is teaching it. I think that we assume students are coming to our classrooms knowing these words already. They kind of create these strange gaps in a student's knowledge. We want teachers to be aware of those shared vocabulary words and to be sure to be explicitly addressing them. Because if students don't have those tier 2 words, they will have a lot of difficulty struggling to understand the tier 3 concepts that our curriculum demands that they understand. So here's another place where I'd like you to pause the video and keep these words up on the screen if possible and have a conversation about these words and where you think they fit. So if you could take a moment and just answer this question, show of hands maybe, to which subject area do the words below belong? And once that's done, we will continue the slide. So here's what we know from research about teaching vocabulary. Instruction plays a huge role in literacy development, and that if we do conform to the principles of how vocabulary is acquired, we can help students make connections, and it has to be done deliberately. Prior to the 1980s, there wasn't a lot of evidence about how comprehension did benefit from vocabulary instruction. And what research found was that the way they were teaching vocabulary 30 years ago, word followed by definition, read it over and over again, memorize it, this was good for helping a student understand the vocabulary word itself, but it didn't lead to comprehension, meaning that a student could memorize a word and its definition, but not be able to use that word correctly in a sentence or not be able to apply the concept that the word is associated with. It was simply rote memorization. Since then, what we've learned is that true vocabulary acquisition depends on context and connection. Students who engage in activities developed around these words and to deepen the knowledge and exposure to them are more likely to retain them and understand them. And research has also shown that high levels of discussion are effective for vocabulary instruction, which kind of makes sense. If a student is given a chance to say the word out loud, they're more likely to own the word and to use it again. Students might also be able to make better connections. In the math example I used in a previous video, there was the word linear. If we point out to a student that the word linear contains the word line inside it and that the connection is there, and to repeat that over and over again, students are more likely to be able to make the connection when they encounter those things independently. Let's take a look at the student profile of successful readers versus struggling readers, reminding you, of course, that you are a successful reader, even if you don't choose to read as a hobby. The average 12th grader knows about 80,000 words, meaning that you know at least 80,000 words. And this might be surprising, or you might be kind of, there's no way I do. If you consider the access to tier 3 vocabulary that you have now that you maybe didn't have 10 years ago. And I like to kind of just think of the way that we like to spend our free time, right? When a true hockey fan gets into a conversation with another, I can't follow because I don't know what icing is. There's all sorts of words that inform and build up that 80,000 words. So successful readers read more and are able to become better readers as they read. They are also exposed to and learn more words, so they have higher vocabularies than those who struggle. Struggling readers are they read less and are exposed to fewer words. And as a result, they don't automatically develop the strategies that a successful reader will. Struggling readers don't enjoy reading and will not choose it as an independent activity and will struggle when they are asked to do that kind of independent activity in a classroom context. A lot of them lack the awareness of how words work. And this is something that a successful reader will pick up. A struggling reader will not. And so it is up to the teacher to explain those things to them. As these struggling readers get older, and this is, I think, something we see in secondary education quite often, because they struggle in, let's say, grade six, they have limited content knowledge of the grade six curriculum that the grade seven curriculum explicitly or implicitly builds on. This is called the Matthew effect. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer in terms of vocabulary. The student will fall further and further behind because their prior knowledge pool is smaller and smaller, where the successful readers continue to advance. So what can teachers do? We need to focus on the words that the students need to know. We're already doing this. The curriculum, it helps us do it. Directing words also help us do it. And we can talk a little bit today about what kind of words to choose. Having that loose categorization between tier one, tier two, tier three words may help. And I think too, it's worth looking at your TOSREC data and saying who are the students that are struggling with comprehension, and then further breaking that down. Are they struggling with comprehension because of vocabulary, or is it one of the other five pillars, fluency, phonemic awareness, phonics? That should be the first thing to help you determine what to do. But since this is a vocabulary focused presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about three options for increasing the vocabulary that your school can work on. Bringing Words to Life, Robust Vocabulary Instruction, is a book that I highly recommend as a method to teach vocabulary. These scholars, Beck and McEwen, were the ones who created this tier one, tier three, tier two categorization. Chapter 5, which focuses on middle school and the older students, is posted on my SharePoint page. So you don't even need to purchase the whole book. The chapter is right there for you. What they have is a pretty methodical approach to teaching students vocabulary. The starting point is the text that the student is studying. It makes a lot of sense for the words to be taken from those texts so that students encounter them in context. The chapter that is posted on the SharePoint goes into much richer detail, so I will give just a brief overview here to give you an idea of what is recommended. They recommend no fewer than 10 words a week for students to be able to actually noticeably acquire vocabulary. So if you're looking for a big leap in your own students, it will require major input on your part. But it says right in the chapter that they have done studies with fewer words and the results have not been as noticeable. So it's unsurprising to say that you'll get out of it what you put in. Saying the word out loud to students so that they understand what it sounds like. Defining the words in a student-friendly way. There are dictionaries linked there so that you don't have to generate these definitions on your own. They exist on the internet already. Providing activities for the students to understand the word in context. And these aren't necessarily whole lessons. This would be kind of like a bell ringer activity or something to get the class started. 2 minutes, 1 minute at most for having the students interact with the word in a variety of ways. And then just to check and to see if the students understand. And then to kind of repeat this as often as you can for a student to be able to kind of start incorporating that word into their own comprehension. So you might have heard the saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, but teach a man to fish, and suddenly you don't see your husband or son on weekends anymore. Kind of a sexist saying. Anyway, in this analogy, the fish are morphemes. And it's based on the premise that if we teach students the smallest pieces of meaning that exist in language, morphemes, that we are then giving them access to words that are related to those morphemes. And they can start to, use prefixes and suffixes and base words to understand words when they meet them out of context. And there is research to prove that this is effective. Morphology literally means the study of form, morph meaning form or shape, ology meaning study, and that explanation is a morphological explanation of the word. Strong readers can often deduce the meaning of a word by looking at morphemes in context, but struggling readers cannot. They don't have as much exposure and they don't have the prior knowledge to be able to make a connection between what the word, for example, morph means. Now, this morphological approach would be separate from robust vocabulary instruction, but it's also possible to do both. And it's very likely that you're doing this in your classroom whenever you encounter a word that seems like it would need this kind of explanation. What we're saying here is all words would benefit from this kind of explanation, for you to break the words down into the meaningful parts, and then for you to provide opportunities for students to start connecting those parts. When teaching these new words, don't only consider the spelling of the word, but also how the morphemes change meanings of the word. Here we have the example of the prefix re, which means to do again, and you understand how the prefix d would mean to undo could be applied to these words as well. These things do need to be explained to students, and it's likely that they've had these explanations given to them before in earlier grades, but if it really does take 12 exposures for that thing to be understood, the student's probably on exposure 7 by the time they come to us in grade 7. Now, there are rules to morphological study, the concept of free morphemes and bound morphemes, but again, it's worth doing, and the consistency of hearing these things across the grades will increase the student's comprehension of these concepts so quickly. Now, I've seen in science classrooms, for example, teachers that have morphemes related to their content area posted on the walls. And I think that is an excellent strategy, and I hope that everybody could do that with every subject that would apply. This is also a UDL strategy because those things exist not just for students to be reminded, but for maybe they need to access during an assessment or during a work period. The next step forward after posting those things somewhere in your classroom would be to deliberately single out one of these morphemes, go through it, explain its relationship, explain its origin, and to have small 30-second, 1-minute activities for students to interact with those words. Having them around constantly is a reminder and could also be a preview for a student as what is to come. And then you as a teacher, when you get to unit 2, whatever that might be in your context, you can say, oh, there's that word over there. It's been there all along. Now we're going to talk about it specifically. And that kind of repetition and that kind of deliberate exposure would make a significant difference to those students who struggle. There are morpheme lists that are subject specific posted online, and those links are also posted on the SharePoint site for you to access. The final vocabulary strategy that I would recommend would be structured word inquiry. Now, this is a very specific method, and it's tied to the author Peter Bowers, and all his work can be found at wordworkskingston.com. Again, post on the SharePoint for you. But it's based on the premise that the primary function of English is to represent meaning, and that the rules of English are actually very concrete and tied to meaning. You might have seen those Facebook posts where it's like rough is spelled like this, but dough is spelled like that. His argument is that those things are not confusing or accidental. They're inherently part of how language works. So if scientific inquiry is something that, again, ties into the way that you are approaching understanding in your school, this would likely be a very suitable approach to vocabulary. Peter Bowers does make room for 2 approaches to the structured word inquiry implementation, whether it be teacher-led or student or inquiry-led, but it is a program. Now, there are resources, and he does give talks posted to his website consistently. In fact, he gives a free workshop every Monday at 5 p.m. As a way to support teachers with this. His book is called Teaching How the Written Word Works. So there is a cost associated with this approach, but I do highly recommend his resources and a session of his. I find it quite fascinating. Another hallmark of structured inquiry is this word matrix. And it's confusing to kind of look at because this is the finished product of what would be a process of you building this with your students. So of those 3, I think it's worth, again, if you are going to, as a staff, make a concerted effort to address your students' vocabulary, to discuss which of these 3 seem most reasonable, doable, and suitable to your school context. So this would be the beginning, I guess, of setting you on a path. And one thing I do want to say too is that this is not a path that your school has to walk alone. All the secondary curriculum consultants are aware of this PD series and the TOSREC and the reading screeners, as well as how the data from the TOSREC informs their own subject area. And I and any of the curriculum consultants would be happy to come to your school to help you make plans to put some kind of vocabulary program or comprehension program or fluency program into place. And we would do whatever you need to help your students become more proficient readers. I will be back again on January 26th with the final session related to these reading screeners. Please fill out the feedback form. It is at the bottom of the SharePoint page, or send me an email with any feedback, suggestions, questions, and thank you for your time and attention. Bye.